My name is Laurel, I'm 29, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a freelance web designer, the kind of job that suits people who prefer the quiet corners of life. But this isn't a story about work. It's about a quiet kind of disappearance. The kind that doesn't come with slammed doors or dramatic ultimatums. It comes with changed passwords and subtle omissions, and you don't realize you've vanished until there's no trace of you left. It started with the Wi-Fi. I was working from my favorite cafe downtown when my playlist suddenly stopped. At first, I thought it was the cafe's spotty internet acting up again. But when I got home and my phone didn't connect to the house network, I paused. I had been using that same network for years. The saved connection was gone. The password no longer worked. A part of me wanted to believe it was nothing, a technical issue, a random reset. But then the mailbox changed. The next morning, I went to grab the mail and saw that my name had been removed. In its place was my younger brother's, Jeremy. Neatly labeled, freshly taped. I stood there, staring at it longer than I should have, feeling a strange weight settle behind my ribs. It didn't feel like an accident, but I told myself it had to be. That night, I noticed the family group chat was missing from my phone. The one we'd used for years to share holiday plans, baby photos, and grocery lists. It hadn't gone silent. It had been removed, just for me. No notification, no explanation, just gone. I stared at my phone for a long time. That was the moment the truth began to rise, slow and cold, like a tide I couldn't hold back. One by one, the parts of home I'd taken for granted were peeling away. The locks hadn't changed, but I was no longer invited inside. Before I take you deeper into what happened and what I found out that changed everything, I want to invite you to stay close. Subscribe to this channel if you've ever felt like you were slowly erased by the people you once loved most. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever had to rebuild from emotional silence. Growing up, I was the helper, the reliable one, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, who kept the peace, who did everything right. After my parents divorced, I became my mother's shadow. I filled in the space my father left behind. I learned early that being needed was the closest thing to being loved. While my younger brother was praised for simply existing, I was praised for what I did, how much I carried, how little I asked for. I helped raise him while keeping up with school, work, and emotional labor that was far too heavy for a teenager. But I never questioned it. It felt normal. It felt like duty. By the time I was 25, I moved into a small apartment downtown. It wasn't a big move, just a quiet decision to claim a little space for myself. I still visited every week, still brought groceries, still helped my mom with bills when I could. But something had shifted. The moment I stopped being constantly available, the closeness began to fray. Jeremy moved back in after dropping out of college. My mother, who had once leaned so heavily on me, suddenly found renewed energy. She cooked his favorite meals. She rearranged the house for him. She smiled in ways I hadn't seen since I was a child, and slowly, I stopped being needed. At first, it was small things, missed calls, unanswered texts. Then birthdays passed without invitations. Dinners were forgotten. My presence became optional, then unnecessary, then unwelcome. When I lost access to the Wi-Fi, when my name vanished from the mailbox, when the group chat disappeared from my phone, it wasn't just technology changing, it was proof that I had been replaced. I sat in my apartment that night, stunned, trying to understand how it happened, how someone like me, who never asked for much, who showed up, stayed kind, stayed quiet, could be dismissed so completely. But that was just the beginning. Because the next morning, an email arrived from our family's longtime lawyer. The subject line was formal, cold, the kind you don't expect to receive unless someone's died or been betrayed. And when I opened it, I realized I had been both. It's strange how you can live most of your life in the same house and still miss the moment it stops being your home. Not because you left or packed or made some grand decision to move on, but because the people inside quietly closed the door on you. The hinges didn't creak, the lock didn't click. You just walked out one day and weren't invited back in. As I sat with that email from the family lawyer sitting unread in my inbox, my body frozen with dread, I found myself drifting backward. Not to recent months, not even to my 20s, but all the way back to where it started. The place I first learned to disappear quietly. I was 9 when my father left, not in the dramatic way some men do. There was no shouting, no slammed doors. He simply packed a small bag one morning, kissed me on the forehead, and said he'd call me soon. I watched him drive away, waiting for the tears to fall. But they didn't. Not then. I think some part of me already knew. He moved to Seattle a few months later and remarried within a year. My mother never recovered. I don't think she ever truly believed he was capable of leaving. She had built her life around him, around the idea of permanence. And when that was taken from her, it was like watching the air drain from a balloon. She deflated, but didn't collapse. That made it worse. There was no dramatic moment, just a steady dimming. In the silence that followed, I became her shadow. I learned quickly that sadness doesn't like to be left alone, so I stayed close. I started making my own school lunches. I helped with laundry. I cleaned without being asked. I listened when she needed to talk, even if the words weren't for me. My brother Jeremy was only 5 then. He had no real memory of the marriage before it ended, no memory of the softness in our house when it was whole. He was allowed to stay light, distracted, insulated. I didn't resent him at first. He was just a kid. But I remember the way my mother clung to him, smiled at him, praised him for the smallest gestures, the way she needed him to be happy because she couldn't bear another sadness, and the way I became the one expected to carry the rest. By the time I was in middle school, I had stopped talking about myself, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because no one asked. If I was quiet and helpful, things stayed calm. If I cried or complained, the atmosphere shifted, so I stopped. I did my homework, I made dinner, I kept the peace, and I convinced myself that was enough. In high school, I started working part-time at a bookstore to help with groceries. I never spent my paychecks on myself. I handed them to my mother in full, and she'd always say thank you without looking me in the eye. Jeremy, on the other hand, became the storm in the house, tantrums, suspensions, outbursts. But no matter how loud he got, the rules never changed. He was protected. I was expected. When I got into college, I didn't move away. I commuted an hour each way so I could stay home and help. I didn't even consider another option. My friends asked why I didn't want a dorm or freedom, but I told them I liked being close to home. I lied. The truth was that I was afraid of what would happen if I left. Not to me, but to her. I had become her quiet support beam, and I didn't know what she'd do if I removed myself. Even when I graduated, I stayed. I found freelance work, started building my own client list, and continued to live in that same house. Jeremy left briefly for college, then dropped out after a semester. When he returned, he was angrier, more entitled. But instead of being met with consequences, he was welcomed back with relief. She gave him the bigger room. She cooked his favorite meals again. She called him her second chance. And I didn't ask for anything. I told myself it was okay. I had my own schedule. I had space to work. I could keep the peace from a different corner. But the truth was, I had started to vanish long before the Wi-Fi disconnected. When I finally moved out at 25, it was quiet. No goodbyes, no resistance. I told my mother I had found a small place with a friend, And she simply nodded. Jeremy barely acknowledged it. I thought the space would help us all breathe, but the opposite happened. The less they saw me, the less they remembered I existed. I kept calling. I kept visiting. I still showed up on weekends, still helped when asked, but gradually, the phone calls stopped being returned. The text messages grew shorter. My name wasn't mentioned in conversations anymore. And then, one day, I wasn't part of the conversation at all. There's a particular ache that comes not from rejection, but from being slowly phased out by people who never bothered to tell you why. It makes you question everything about your worth, your memory, whether the love you believed in was ever real. And now, staring at that cold email from the lawyer, pending estate update, immediate response required, I realized I wasn't just being emotionally erased. Something deeper was being shifted behind closed doors, something legal, something financial, something involving my name. I had always assumed that when my grandfather passed, the family would honor his wishes. He was the only one who ever saw me, really saw me. He remembered my birthdays. He praised my work. He asked real questions. And he had promised that when the time came, there would be something left for me. Not out of obligation, but because he believed I deserved it. And now, that promise was hanging in the air, fragile, threatened. I hadn't opened the email yet. I was too afraid, because part of me knew that what I was about to learn would confirm my deepest fear. Not that I had been left out accidentally, but that someone had made the conscious decision to remove me, not just from the Wi-Fi, but from the legacy I had once been promised. I didn't open the email that night. I couldn't. It sat there in my inbox like a sealed verdict, and I circled it in my mind for hours, as if staring long enough would somehow change the words inside. I thought if I gave it just one more hour, one more night, one more breath of time, it might go away. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to learn what had already been decided without me. I went to sleep in silence, but I didn't rest. My body lay still, but my thoughts raced. Every detail from the last few months replayed itself. Every shift in tone, every unanswered message, every fading invitation. The things I'd once told myself were accidents or forgetfulness now felt intentional, calculated, as if a decision had already been made, and the only person left in the dark was me. The next morning, I opened the email. I don't remember reading the first sentence. I only remember the sensation, like the floor shifted just slightly, just enough to make me uncertain of my footing. It wasn't a dramatic announcement, not even cruel, just administrative. A matter-of-fact notice about updates to my grandfather's estate, the execution of final documents, and the distribution of assets. It listed the recipients: my mother, my brother, a trust in Jeremy's name. Nothing in mine. There was no mention of me, no explanation, no apology, just absence. The lawyer included a polite note encouraging me to reach out with questions, but I already knew. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error. It was the end result of a slow erasure that had started long ago, long before I noticed the Wi-Fi, the mailbox, the chat. This was the final step in a process of quietly removing me from the family story. I sat at my kitchen table, my coffee untouched, the weight of it all pressing into my chest. I tried to think logically, tried to give myself reasons, possible explanations that didn't point to betrayal. Maybe the will had been changed while I was away. Maybe Grandpa had been pressured. Maybe someone had told him I didn't need anything, that I was doing fine, that Jeremy needed it more. But each excuse felt more like a justification, and the ache in my gut told me the truth. I wasn't meant to find out. They didn't expect I'd be contacted directly. I was supposed to stay quiet, stay small, stay forgotten. I wasn't part of the plan anymore. And that's when the anger began to bloom. Not loud or explosive, but deep and pulsing, like a slow burn just beneath the surface. I had been so careful, so gentle all my life. I had given and supported and stayed silent through every twist of our fractured family dynamic. And when I finally stepped away, even quietly, even respectfully, they took it as permission to erase me entirely. I thought about my grandfather, the man who had always seen me. He was quiet too, but never unkind. He had once told me that clarity was the most honest gift a person could give, that people deserve to know where they stand. But no one had given me that. Not my mother, not Jeremy, not anyone. They had pulled the rug from under me and expected I'd never look down to notice. I started digging, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. I went through my old emails, photos, anything I had from Grandpa. I searched for clues, for evidence that I hadn't imagined our connection. I found birthday cards he'd sent me with careful handwriting, always including little notes about how proud he was of me, about how impressed he was by my independence. I found a draft of a document he had once mentioned, something about a family trust, tucked away in an old hard drive. My name was on it. It was dated 4 years ago. I printed it out and held it in my hands, reading every word slowly. It wasn't a legal will, just a rough plan, a draft, but it was enough. Enough to know that I had been included once. Enough to know I had been remembered. So the question became, when did that change? And who made the change? It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't about assets or property. It was about something much more fragile. Recognition, inclusion, truth. I wasn't looking to cash in on anything. I just wanted to understand how I went from being part of a family to being an afterthought, a shadow on the edge of a photograph. I reached out to the lawyer. I kept my tone measured, professional. I asked if there had been updates or amendments. I asked if I had ever been listed. I asked when I had been removed. The response came quickly. He informed me that the most recent will had been executed 2 years ago, revised by my mother and submitted through legal channels with full authority. It had passed probate without objection. All was final. I had not been included. The words felt clinical, like a sterile wall had gone up between me and everything I thought I knew. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. 2 years ago, I was still helping with errands. I was still visiting for birthdays, still part of the group chat. And yet, even then, decisions were being made behind closed doors. My name was being scrubbed from papers while I still brought groceries through their front door. The realization landed hard. This had nothing to do with mistakes. It was a choice. Someone, likely my mother, maybe both of them, had decided that I no longer belonged, that my presence was optional, that I could be removed from not just dinners and conversations, but from the story entirely. They had rewritten the family's future, and I had been edited out. I wish I could say I cried, but I didn't. The sadness had calcified into something else, a kind of knowing, a quiet clarity that I was finally seeing things as they truly were. I wasn't overlooked. I was erased. And now that I knew, there was no unknowing. Whatever came next, I couldn't go back. Not to the person who made excuses, not to the daughter who stayed silent, not to the sister who stood on the sidelines while someone else rewrote the ending. There's a point in every silence where it stops being peaceful and starts becoming a kind of punishment. The absence of words, the lack of explanations, the space left by people who once called you family, it all turns heavy. And once you realize the weight you've been carrying wasn't yours to hold, it's hard to keep pretending it doesn't hurt. In the days after I read that email, I found myself suspended in a kind of numbness, not dramatic, not panicked, just blank. I still showed up for work, still answered emails, still returned client calls with a calm, professional voice. But inside, I was unraveling, slowly, quietly. like a thread being pulled from the hem of a garment you didn't realize was holding you together. I stopped calling my mother, not out of protest, but because I no longer knew what to say. I had questions, of course, so many, but I already knew I wouldn't get answers. I already knew that whatever explanation she might offer would come too late or not at all. There was something final in her silence, something deliberate. For years, I had told myself that loyalty meant staying close, being available, absorbing the discomfort so others didn't have to. I had given my mother everything I had: my time, my care, my effort, my quiet compliance. And in the end, she handed that trust to someone else and made a place for me to disappear. I kept thinking about the way she had celebrated Jeremy's return, how she had cooked his favorite meals, rearranged the house for him, planned his job party that I wasn't invited to. She had given him more than support. She had given him a spotlight, and I had received silence, distance, a careful erasure. When I tried to retrace it, to find the exact moment things shifted, I couldn't. There was no single turning point, no final argument. It was death by omission. One family dinner I wasn't told about, one shared photo I was cropped out of, one financial decision made without my name. At some point, I had simply become inconvenient. Not because I was cruel, not because I was reckless, but because I had finally chosen my own life. I had moved into my own space. I had set boundaries. I had asked to be seen not as a helper, but as a person. And in doing so, I became too difficult to keep. That was the cost of no longer being easy to use. Still, I tried to make sense of it. I scoured old emails and texts, looking for signs. There were messages from my mother years ago where she called me her rock, her anchor, her only stability. Back then, I'd taken pride in those words. I thought they meant love. Now I saw them for what they really were: assignments. She hadn't seen me. She had seen what I could do for her. It's a brutal thing to realize the love you thought you earned was actually conditional. Jeremy, on the other hand, had always existed without terms. His failures were forgiven before they were even acknowledged. His mistakes explained away. His absence overlooked. And when he returned, when he wanted back in, the door had already been open for him. I thought of the group chat, how it had started when Grandpa first got sick. It was meant to be a shared space. Updates, reminders, plans. I had managed it. I had made sure everyone stayed connected, that nothing fell through the cracks. When Grandpa died, I was the one who arranged the memorial slideshow, contacted his old friends, helped the lawyer with documents. I had done the work, quietly, without complaint. And still, when it came time to finalize the estate, I wasn't even copied in the decision. It wasn't just the inheritance, it was what it symbolized. I wasn't part of the future they were building. I wasn't part of the story they wanted to tell. And the more I looked at the pieces, the clearer it became. I had already been written out. That weekend, I didn't leave my apartment. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen, watching the cursor blink. I tried to work, but the designs felt meaningless. I opened old sketch files and closed them again. Nothing I touched felt real. I was floating, weightless, outside of everything that once grounded me. I didn't tell anyone, not my coworkers, not my friends, not even the few people I occasionally confided in. I was ashamed, not of being left out, but of how long it had taken me to see it. There's a loneliness that comes from abandonment, but there's another, deeper kind that comes from betrayal without explanation. When people leave, you grieve. When people erase you, you question your own existence. The only thing that kept me tethered was the memory of my grandfather. He had been the one constant, the one person who looked at me and didn't see responsibility or sacrifice. He saw talent, potential. He asked about my work not just to be polite, but because he genuinely cared. He asked how I felt. He remembered the names of my friends. He showed up to my first art showing even when no one else did. So I started there. I went to the one place I had avoided for years, the box in the back of my closet. It was filled with keepsakes, most of which I hadn't looked at since he died. Old letters, photos, a thumb drive he had once given me with scanned images from his childhood. And there, buried beneath the layers of time, I found the original copy of the trust plan he had drafted. It wasn't a final document. It had no legal weight, but it was in his handwriting. It listed me, by name, with equal shares. It was dated 1 year before he died. I held it in my hands like it was glass. It didn't solve anything. It wouldn't reverse what had been done, but it was proof. Proof that once I had been remembered. That once I had been seen. I wasn't imagining the connection. I hadn't fabricated the closeness. I hadn't dreamed the love. It was real. And that was when I made the decision. I didn't know what the outcome would be, or whether anyone would listen, or if it was even worth pursuing. But I was done pretending. I was done playing small. I was done making peace with silence. If they were going to erase me, they were going to have to watch me come back into focus. And this time, I wouldn't disappear quietly. I didn't tell anyone where I was going that day. I didn't dress like someone on a mission or someone who needed to be taken seriously. I just pulled on jeans, a sweater, and tied my hair back like it was any other Tuesday. But everything inside me felt like a storm about to break. For years, I had been the quiet one, the steady one, the good one. And now I was walking into a law office with a paper in my bag that felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. It wasn't legal. It wasn't binding. But it had my grandfather's handwriting on it, my name, and something that felt like a promise. I had printed the draft copy of his original trust plan the night before. I had reread it 3 times, comparing it to the estate summary I'd received in that email. And what I saw couldn't be dismissed. In his original plan, the shares were split equally. My name was right there beside Jeremy's. But in the final execution, my name was gone. No explanation. No trace. And the man who had sent me that email? He had once called himself a family friend. He had known me since I was a child. I remembered him standing beside my grandfather at barbecues, laughing with a hand on his shoulder, promising to keep things in order when the time came. And now here I was, the granddaughter who wasn't supposed to notice, asking for an appointment like I was just another name in his inbox. I stepped into the waiting room, trying to keep my shoulders back, my voice calm, my hands from trembling. I gave the receptionist my name and waited. It felt like I waited forever. When they finally called me in, I sat across from him in a room filled with leather and quiet judgment, and I pulled the document from my bag like it was a photograph of someone long dead. I spoke carefully. I asked questions like someone looking for clarity, not confrontation. I tried to keep the emotion out of my voice, but the truth was, I was holding my breath the entire time. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about being acknowledged, about being remembered, about confirming that I hadn't imagined the way my grandfather looked at me when he said he believed in me. The lawyer skimmed the document. He nodded slowly. He said it wasn't the final version. That plans change, that families make decisions, that legal documents sometimes go through multiple drafts before finalization. But none of that answered my question. None of that explained why my name had disappeared completely, or why no one had told me, or why I was being spoken to now like a stranger asking for scraps. As I left his office, something inside me hardened, not into anger, but into resolve. I walked back through the city like someone waking up inside their own life for the first time. The streets looked different, sharper, and the truth settled into my bones with terrifying clarity. No one was going to fight for me. No one was going to bring my name back to the table. No one was going to say, "We made a mistake. Let's fix it." If I wanted to be seen again, I had to stand up in the middle of a room where they had already closed the doors and say, "I'm still here." That night, I pulled out everything I had, every saved message, every email, every scrap of handwriting. I organized it into folders. I created a timeline. I looked at the dates of the estate updates, the revision filings, the witness statements. There was a pattern, a window of time where everything shifted, right after Grandpa's health took a sharp decline, right around the time I had stopped spending nights at the house. It had been timed perfectly. While he was fading, while I was moving out, while everyone assumed I wouldn't notice because I was too quiet to ask questions. But I was noticing now. I remembered the day my grandfather told me he was setting up the trust. It was quiet, almost casual. He said it wasn't about wealth, it was about values, about making sure the people he loved had something that reflected his care for them. I had brushed it off at the time. I was young and didn't want to talk about death. But now those words came back to me like a lifeline. I wasn't imagining things. He had included me. I had mattered. Still, I knew I couldn't win this through emotion. I needed more than memories. I needed facts. So I started reaching out. Gently, carefully. I contacted an old neighbor of my grandfather's who used to help him with errands. I found a retired accountant who had done his books for years and who still had copies of old drafts and communications. I tracked down a paralegal who had once worked at the firm where the final version of the will had been filed. Piece by piece, a picture emerged, not of malicious intent, but of something more subtle and insidious: pressure, influence, decisions made when a man was no longer fully lucid, updates signed in haste, conversations behind closed doors. And through all of it, one thing became painfully clear. My mother had been in control of it all. She had positioned herself as the executor. She had submitted the documents. She had met with the lawyer without telling me. And when it was over, when my name had been quietly removed, she hadn't said a word. The realization landed like a stone in my stomach. It wasn't just that I had been forgotten. I had been edited out by the person I had spent my whole life protecting. I sat with that truth for a long time. And then I made a decision. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to demand or scream or beg. I was going to gather every piece of evidence. I was going to speak with my own lawyer. I was going to lay out the pattern. I was going to walk into the story they had tried to rewrite without me and write myself back in. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for visibility. Because I had been invisible long enough. There's a strange moment just before you confront someone you once loved, when time seems to freeze, your breath slows, the world feels muffled, like it's underwater. Your body knows something irreversible is about to happen, even if your heart isn't ready to admit it. I felt that moment as I parked outside my mother's house for the first time in over a year. The same driveway I used to shovel in the winter, the same porch I used to decorate for Halloween. Now it felt foreign, sterile, like I was trespassing on a memory that no longer belonged to me. I hadn't planned to come. I had rehearsed every conversation in my head but had avoided the actual confrontation. It was easier to collect documents, to make phone calls, to build my case in silence. But the weight of everything I'd uncovered demanded presence. And even if I didn't get the answers I needed, I had to look them in the eye. I had called the day before, left a message. I hadn't received a response and I didn't expect one. But I went anyway. The house looked almost the same. A little cleaner, maybe. The windows brighter, the yard more manicured. I noticed the car in the driveway. Jeremy's. Of course. He had moved back in years ago and never left. It was his name on the mailbox now. his shoes by the front door, his voice that probably echoed through the kitchen when he laughed. I used to know what that felt like, to be part of a home. Now I was a visitor. I walked up the porch, my hands slightly shaking. I knocked. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, and then I saw the blinds shift in the living room window. Someone was home. They had seen me. Still, no one came to the door. That's when the full truth landed in my chest, not just intellectually, but physically. The realization that I had been replaced wasn't just symbolic. It was literal. They had seen me, and they had chosen to stay behind the walls. There's something crueler than shouting. It's indifference, the kind of silence that says, "You're no longer our problem." I stood there for several minutes, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, to pound on the door, to demand acknowledgement. But the stronger part of me, the part that had been rebuilding in quiet, steady ways, knew that I didn't need their permission to feel what I felt. I didn't need their presence to confirm what I already knew. I turned back toward my car and sat behind the wheel, staring at the steering wheel as my vision blurred. It wasn't just about being disinherited. It wasn't even about the betrayal anymore. It was about how invisible I had become. Not just in their lives, but in the version of our family that now existed without me. For most of my life, I had tried to earn my place through usefulness. I cleaned. I cooked. I stayed quiet. I helped pay bills. I solved problems. And for a long time, I thought that made me valuable. But the truth was simpler and more painful. I had been convenient, until I wasn't. When I moved out, I didn't slam the door or demand distance. I thought I was making room for my own life. I thought I could still belong while also being free. But they saw it differently. They saw my independence as abandonment. And instead of telling me that, they removed me, one layer at a time, until nothing remained. I remembered when my mother used to call me her rock. When Jeremy was struggling, when the bills piled up, when everything felt unstable, she turned to me. But once things began to stabilize again, once Jeremy found his footing, once the house felt less chaotic, I was no longer needed. And eventually, not even wanted. I had built my life around being indispensable. And the second I wasn't, they let me go. That moment on the porch, standing there, knocking into silence, wasn't the confrontation I had planned, but it was the closure I needed. Because I finally understood that they weren't going to give me answers. They weren't going to admit what they had done. And they weren't going to invite me back in. I started my car and drove without direction, through old neighborhoods, past the library where I used to tutor, past the park where Grandpa used to walk his dog. Everything looked the same. But I had changed, and that shift was irreversible now. Later that night, I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by documents, the estate paperwork, Grandpa's draft trust, letters, voicemails. I opened my laptop and began organizing it all again, not because I didn't already know what I'd found, but because something inside me needed to put the chaos into order. I needed to reclaim the narrative. I remembered the voice of my grandfather, always calm, always deliberate. He believed in clarity, in legacy, in being fair. I knew without doubt that he never intended to leave me out. But intentions don't protect you when others are willing to rewrite the story. And that's what they had done. My mother, Jeremy, whoever else had been involved. They had built a version of our family where I no longer existed, where my absence was more comfortable than my truth. But I was still here. I didn't have a seat at their table anymore. I didn't have a key to the front door. But I had something better now, the ability to name what happened, to stop minimizing it, to stop telling myself I was imagining things, to stop waiting for an apology that would never come. That night, I didn't cry. I expected to, but the tears never came. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest. Not peace, but power. Because for the first time in my life, I had stopped knocking on a door that was never going to open. And I was finally turning toward the life waiting on the other side. The silence after the confrontation wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. Not the absence of words, but the complete void where a relationship used to live. I had shown up at the house. I had knocked. I had given them the chance to acknowledge me, and they had chosen to pretend I wasn't there. After that, nothing was left to say. But something had shifted inside me. I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. The days that followed didn't come with explosive emotion. They were strange in their stillness. I still worked, still answered emails, still watered the plant on my windowsill every morning like it was the only living thing tethering me to a sense of routine. But behind that normalcy, I was slowly building something invisible, an internal kind of armor. I had already gathered the paperwork. I had already reviewed the timelines. I had already begun to suspect what had happened. But now, I was ready to act. I scheduled a consultation with a new lawyer, not the one who had handled the estate. He was too close to the family, too familiar with their version of events. I found someone neutral, unbiased, a woman who specialized in estate disputes and undue influence. I didn't tell her everything in the first meeting. I didn't need to. The facts were enough. My name had been present in the original documents. It had disappeared in the final version. The executor had a direct interest in the redistribution. She listened, took notes, and laid out my options in terms that were cold but clear. There was a path forward. It would be slow. It would be complicated. And it would require me to stand in a space I had spent my whole life avoiding, the space of conflict. That was the hardest part. Not the legal process itself, but the emotional terrain it required me to walk through. I had spent years trying to be easy, accommodating, agreeable. I avoided confrontations so often that I forgot what it felt like to stand my ground. But now, there was no room left for softness. I submitted my petition quietly. There was no announcement, no warning, just paperwork, filed with care and intention. My lawyer advised me not to reach out to them, not to explain, not to justify, not to offer emotional closure. And I listened, because for the first time in my life, I understood that I didn't owe them anything. The formal notification was sent to the estate's executor, my mother. She would learn, in black and white legal terms, that I wasn't going away quietly, that I had a voice, that I was paying attention. I imagined her face when she opened that letter. I wondered if it stung, or if she'd already braced for it. Maybe she had always known it would come. I'll never know what she felt, because she never responded, not directly, not even through a lawyer. But a week later, I started receiving strange messages from distant relatives, mutual acquaintances, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were casual, some were pointed. Some asked questions that felt more like accusations. It was clear she had started talking, spinning her version, painting me as unstable, greedy, dramatic. I could hear her voice in their tone, her subtle ability to twist facts into fiction, to make omission look like kindness. She had always been good at that, controlling the story by choosing what not to say. I didn't defend myself, not to them, not to anyone, because I had already spent too many years trying to explain my value to people determined not to see it. Instead, I focused on the case. My lawyer subpoenaed documents, reviewed the timeline, compared my grandfather's health records with the date of the final revision. It all pointed to something undeniable. The changes had been made during a period of mental decline. Witnesses were inconsistent. Signatures were questionable. The influence was evident, even if the intent couldn't be proven. We couldn't reverse the past, but we could ask the court to acknowledge what had happened. And in doing so, we could restore part of what had been taken. But it wasn't just a legal fight. It was emotional excavation. Each form I signed felt like I was rewriting the past. Each phone call felt like I was walking back through years of silence. I saw my childhood in flashbacks I couldn't control, sitting at the kitchen table helping with bills, cleaning the house while my mother napped, filling in spaces my brother never had to see. All the invisible labor I had done in the name of love. Now, that love had turned its back on me. And yet, I was still standing. What surprised me most wasn't their reaction. It was mine. I had expected rage. I had expected grief. But what I felt most often was clarity, a calm I hadn't known was possible. Because every step I took, every page I filed, every quiet act of reclaiming my space reminded me that I was no longer asking to be seen. I was declaring that I existed. The news reached Jeremy eventually. I didn't hear from him directly, but a mutual friend let it slip that he was furious, that he called me ungrateful, that he thought I was trying to destroy the family. But what family? The one that locked me out without warning? The one that deleted my name like it was a typo? He was welcome to his anger. I had carried mine for long enough. By the end of that month, I had stepped fully into the process. Depositions were scheduled, records requested. The estate was now under review, and my place in it, my rightful place, was being questioned not by emotion, but by fact. And through all of this, I did it alone. No support from my mother. No texts from Jeremy. No quiet check-ins from relatives. It was just me, and the truth I refused to let go of. It should have broken me, but it didn't. Because being alone was no longer the same thing as being abandoned. Now it meant I was free. I thought the hardest part would be the legal process, the documents, the hearings, the cold scrutiny of strangers reviewing something so deeply personal. But what no one tells you is that the law moves slowly, that the court doesn't rush grief, that justice doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It shows up in whispers, in delays, in the quiet tension of waiting. But while the legal system took its time, something else began to move faster. The fallout. I had been so focused on the case, on staying composed, on collecting every detail with precision, that I hadn't stopped to consider how it would ripple beyond the courtroom. Because even when families pretend to be private, they still carry their stories in public. And the moment I challenged my erasure, my name returned to conversations I hadn't been part of in years. It began subtly. A neighbor I barely knew stopped me outside the grocery store and asked how I was holding up. A former teacher liked one of my posts on social media, something she hadn't done in nearly a decade. These were people who had known my family, who had seen me grow up, who had attended birthdays and bake sales and holiday concerts. People who remembered me before the story had changed. That was the part I hadn't fully grasped until then. They had rewritten me, not just privately, but publicly. For the past few years, my mother had shaped a narrative about my absence. I didn't know the full details, but I felt the edges of it, that I had drifted, that I had chosen distance, that I was too busy, too sensitive, too unstable to stay connected, and people had accepted it because it was easier to believe a quiet daughter walked away than to ask why she might have been pushed. But now, with the legal dispute in motion, the silence broke. There's something uncomfortable about challenging the very people who raised you. It disrupts the image others have of family. People don't like mess. They don't like when daughters take their mothers to court. They don't like when you say, "This is not okay," especially when you say it without tears or screaming, when you say it with evidence. Some distance themselves. A few old friends stopped reaching out altogether. Others hovered awkwardly, unsure of whether offering support would be seen as betrayal. But for every door that quietly shut, another creaked open. One of my cousins reached out, someone I hadn't spoken to since high school. She told me she had always wondered what had happened to me, that she had asked once, and my mother had dismissed it, that no one had said I was cut out, but everyone had noticed I was missing. It made me realize how long I had been fading from view, not just in the house, but in the larger world. My absence had been explained away in tiny, convenient lies. No one had questioned it. Now they were. The legal investigation uncovered even more than I expected. My lawyer found inconsistencies in the estate's financial records, transfers made shortly before my grandfather passed, decisions filed without proper witnesses, and unusual amendments signed during periods when his mental state had already been in question. It painted a picture not of outright fraud, but of manipulation, of quiet influence used strategically, of access turned into advantage. And at the center of it all was my mother. She hadn't forged anything. She hadn't broken the law. But she had guided things in a direction that served her and Jeremy, and erased me. The court couldn't undo the will entirely, but it acknowledged enough irregularities to open a path forward. I wasn't asking for full reversal. I was asking for fairness, recognition. Even my brother, who had refused to speak to me directly, was now listed on the case. His attorney issued a response that was professional, defensive, detached. I read through every word, each sentence trying to separate emotion from legality. But I saw through it. He knew. He had always known. What surprised me most, though, was my own detachment. I had feared that being pulled into legal conflict would reopen wounds. But what it actually did was clarify the difference between grief and harm. I wasn't mourning the loss of my family anymore. I was acknowledging the harm they had done, and refusing to carry it in silence. There's a dignity in telling the truth even when no one wants to hear it. Even when it costs you relationships, even when it forces you to walk into courtrooms alone. And yet, I wasn't entirely alone. Not in the way I used to be. People began to see me differently, not as dramatic, not as angry, but as brave. As someone willing to say, no more. I received messages from distant friends, quiet notes of encouragement, people who had their own stories of being cut out, erased, pushed aside. My story had given them language for their own. And in that reflection, I found strength I didn't know I had. The final hearing was scheduled for the fall. It wouldn't resolve everything. It wouldn't restore lost years or give back what had been taken from me emotionally. But it would mark a turning point. One where my name was no longer absent from the record. One where I could stop proving my right to exist. What I had learned in this process was brutal but necessary, that truth doesn't always come with validation. Sometimes it comes with loneliness. Sometimes it costs you more than you expect, but sometimes it gives you yourself back. I used to think being forgotten was the worst thing that could happen, but I was wrong. Being erased and choosing to return anyway, that's power. And I was just beginning to feel it. I always thought healing would feel like fireworks, like a sudden breath of air after drowning, like lightness, like clarity, like peace. But when it finally arrived, it came quietly, slowly. It didn't look like triumph. It looked like waking up one morning and realizing I hadn't thought about them for a full hour. Grief has a way of sneaking back in, even when you think you've exercised every part of it. But something had shifted by the time the hearing ended. I didn't win in a dramatic sense. The estate wasn't overturned. I didn't walk out with a massive check or a courtroom apology. But the court had acknowledged enough of what had been done behind closed doors to restore my name into the record. My claim was validated. I wasn't erased anymore. There was no public reckoning, no headlines, no family reunions. The people who cut me out stayed silent. My mother didn't call, Jeremy didn't reach out, but something inside me finally stopped waiting for them to. That was the real shift. For so long, I had built my emotional house on the hope of being welcomed back, on the idea that one day they'd miss me, that someone would wake up and realize they had made a mistake. but I had spent too much of my life holding space in rooms I wasn't wanted in. I was done hoping for reconciliation that required me to keep shrinking to be allowed back in. The first real act of healing was removing the last photo of the three of us from my bookshelf. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. I simply realized I didn't want a daily reminder of people who could pretend I didn't exist. I boxed up the old cards, the voicemail recordings, the birthday notes, not to destroy them, but to let them rest. They had carried too much weight for too long. And I was tired. I started going for walks again, something I hadn't done in months. At first, I didn't even notice how tightly I had been holding myself. My shoulders curled, my arms folded, my pace hurried. I had become used to disappearing into spaces, to shrinking. But with every step outside, I felt a little more air in my lungs, a little more ground beneath my feet. I signed up for a ceramics class at the community center. It was small, quiet. No one there knew my name or my story. I liked it that way. I liked the feel of clay between my hands, the slow rotation of the wheel, the imperfect shapes I molded that somehow still stood on their own. It felt like learning how to hold things again, carefully, without breaking them, including myself. I started opening up to friends again, real ones, not just the kind you text twice a year, but the kind who ask how you really are and don't flinch when the answer isn't easy. I told one of them the story in full for the first time. She didn't offer advice. She just listened. And in her silence, I felt something I hadn't felt from my own family in years. Presence. I began rebuilding boundaries, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. I didn't check my mother's social media anymore. I stopped asking mutual contacts for updates. I let go of the hope that Jeremy would have a moment of clarity, that any of them would. They had written me out of their lives. I was done trying to write myself back in. But I wasn't just healing through separation. I was also discovering something new, my own identity, outside of them. For so long, I had been defined by what I gave. I was the helper, the peacemaker, the one who made things easier for everyone else. When they took that role away from me, I didn't know who I was. But in that space, I found a new version of myself, one who didn't ask permission to take up space. I launched a small design studio of my own. I had thought about it for years, always afraid it was too risky, too self-centered. But now, with nothing left to lose, I took the leap. I built my own website, chose my own clients, created projects that actually excited me. And slowly, something inside me began to shine again. The studio grew, not overnight, but steadily. And with it came something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Not performative pride. Not the kind you wear to impress your family, but the quiet kind that lives in your chest when you know you built something on your own, from the ground up. And in that growth, I stopped needing their validation. I no longer needed a chair at their table. I was building my own. I visited my grandfather's grave on the 1-year mark of the hearing. I hadn't been there since the funeral. I brought flowers, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I sat beside the headstone and closed my eyes, and for a moment, I let myself remember all the parts of him that no one else had seen. The soft strength, the way he used to call me kiddo, the time he told me that being kind doesn't mean being quiet. I whispered thank you, not because I thought he could hear me, but because I needed to say it. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for trying. Thank you for reminding me that I mattered, even when no one else did. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But the tears had dried somewhere in the process of becoming whole again. What remained wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. Because even though he hadn't been able to protect me from what came after, he had left behind enough light for me to find my way out, and I had. That was the most powerful realization of all. I had survived the thing I thought would destroy me, And not only survived it, I had rebuilt from it, with better boundaries, with deeper friendships, with work that fulfilled me, with a version of myself that I actually wanted to keep. Healing hadn't come in a wave, it had come in fragments. A quiet Tuesday where I didn't flinch when my phone rang. A full night of sleep without dreaming of being locked out. The soft sound of laughter that didn't feel borrowed or restrained. I was no longer holding my breath, and in that breath I had found myself again. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, no letter of apology in the mail, and I stopped waiting for one, because healing had already come, and it didn't need a bow. Some people expect justice to feel like revenge, like seeing the people who hurt you fall apart under the weight of their own decisions. But that's not how it happens, at least not for most of us. More often, justice looks like living well without their permission. It looks like waking up each morning with no need to explain yourself. And that's where I found myself, months after everything. My name had been restored in the estate documents, even if the family never acknowledged it. The court had recognized what had been done, even if my mother never looked me in the eyes again. And I had moved forward, not because it was easy, but because staying still would have kept me trapped in a version of myself they had written for me. I was done being the version of me that made everyone else comfortable. The apartment I lived in wasn't fancy. It had peeling paint in the hallway and a heater that worked when it wanted to. But it was mine. Every inch of it held things I chose, books I loved, blankets I bought with no one else's opinion in mind. The couch wasn't coordinated, the dishes didn't match. But when I walked through the front door, it felt like safety. I started hosting small dinners with people who actually saw me, friends who brought wine and stories and sat cross-legged on my rug without judgment. Friends who never asked why my mother hadn't called because they already knew the weight of unanswered questions. They never tried to fix me, they just stayed. I used to think family was something you were born into. Now I think it's something you create from the wreckage of what you lost. The day I filed my last legal document, I walked out of the courthouse and didn't look back. There were no reporters, no audience, no one waiting in the lobby. Just me and the air in my lungs. And it was enough. I walked down the steps and felt something lift. Not the pain. It never leaves entirely. But the responsibility. The illusion that it was somehow my job to hold everyone together. I dropped that weight at the door and didn't pick it back up. I no longer check if I've been added back to the group chat. I no longer look for my name on family mailings. I no longer pause at the holidays wondering if this will be the year someone breaks the silence, because I've stopped mistaking silence for something I need to fill. Some silences are gifts. They leave space for something new to grow. My studio has grown too. I hired a part-time assistant, launched a small mentorship program for women entering the design field, and finally allowed myself to call what I built a real business, not a side hustle. Not a temporary project, a real thing, born from resilience. And with it came a new sense of ownership over my life. I travel now, not far, but enough. Sometimes just to the coast, sometimes to cities I've always wanted to see. I book the ticket. I pack light. I don't ask anyone's permission. There's something healing about walking down a street no one's waiting for you on, where no one knows what you've survived, and realizing you're still whole. I thought closure would come with confrontation, but mine came in the form of freedom, of letting go, and sometimes, when I least expect it, I remember moments from childhood, not the painful ones, but the good ones. My grandfather's laugh when he forgot where he placed his keys, the sound of summer rain through my open window, the smell of cinnamon rolls I made on lazy Saturdays, and I let myself feel them again, not as traps, but as reminders that not everything from back then was broken. Some things were worth saving, even if the people weren't. I don't hate my mother anymore. That surprised me. I thought I would hold on to that anger forever. But what I feel now isn't hate. It's distance. It's recognition. I see her for what she is, for what she chose. And I know that doesn't have to define me. She told herself a story where I was the one who left, and for a while I tried to change that story. Now I just let her keep it. She can live inside her fiction. I don't need to be a character in it anymore. I've written my own. And if you've been erased, if you've been pushed aside, if you've been told in quiet, cruel ways that you don't belong, know this: you are still here. Your name still matters. Even when they stop saying it, even when they delete it. You are not the silence they left behind. You are what comes after it. Thank you for walking through this story with me. If it resonated with you, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe. It helps this space grow. And maybe, just maybe, someone who needs this story will find it because you shared it. May you find peace in the pages you write for yourself, and may the life ahead of you be louder, brighter, and freer than anything they tried to take.